Thanks for joining us for this archive of Teaching American History's first Saturday webinar for the 21-22 school year. This episode aired live on August 21st of 2021 and was the first in our 5-part mini-series for the fall of 2021 about the American Presidency. The focus of today's program was The Executive Power Defined. You can learn more about our webinar series at tah.org/programs/webinars.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our first teachingamericanhistory.org Saturday webinar of this academic year. These webinars are sponsored by the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. TAH.org is the leading online resource for the documents-based study of American history, government, and civics for teachers, students, and citizens. My name is Chris Burkett. I'm Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Ashbrook Scholar Program for undergraduates here at Ashland University. This year, we are drawing inspiration for our webinars from 2 core documents collections published by Ashbrook and available at tah.org. In the spring semester, we'll be discussing populists and progressives. This fall, our theme is the presidency in context, and we are drawing from our American Presidency core documents collection for the first 5 webinars of this series. If you happen to be joining us for the first time, the point of these webinars is to bring together some thoughtful scholars and just have a conversation about important questions. We encourage all of you here today to participate in that conversation by submitting questions in the Q&A function, and as always, we will try to get to as many of those as possible. In the next week, you'll receive an email that will include a link to request a certificate of participation, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from today's program. So the topic of our first webinar of this series is the executive power defined, which is maybe setting a pretty lofty goal for us today. And to help us think about this question, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Jeremy Bailey, who is Director of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma and the editor of our very fine American Presidency core documents collection. And I'm also happy to introduce Dr. Benjamin Kleinerman, who is Professor of Political Science at Baylor University. So good morning, and thanks to you both for joining us this morning.
Morning.
Good morning. Thanks for doing this and for having us.
Yeah, well, I'm grateful for your time, especially as the semester is about to begin. I know you're busy, so we're trying to understand put the presidency in context, and we're talking about the executive power. So we have an hour to define the executive power, or at least get into it anyway. When I look at the Constitution, the first thing I notice is that in Article 1, which deals with Congress, the Constitution seems to be pretty specific in laying out and defining particular powers that Congress has. And then when you look at Article 2, the vesting clause of Article 2, the first thing you notice is that it just says that the executive power shall be vested in the president. And it doesn't seem to go to the lengths that Article 1 does in terms of defining the president or the executive power. So I'm just going to start with a broad question. How do we begin to think about what the Constitution tells us that executive power is? How do you start teaching this? How do you get students to start understanding what the executive power is? Jeremy, I'll defer to you since you're the editor of our collections documents first.
So so I guess in thinking about this question, I mean, our goal today is just to really introduce some big questions that are, a variety of panelists the next couple months will sort of drill down on some more specific examples. But the way that I think about it in the big picture is there are really 2 paths that you can take in interpreting this puzzle that the Constitution leaves us with. The Article 2 says the executive power should be vested in a president of the United States. There is no herein granted. It's not a list of plural executive powers, it's the executive power. So one approach is to say that means all of the executive power. There is this thing called the executive power. We know it when we see it, and the president has it all. The other approach is that, well, no, you shouldn't hang so much interpretive weight on 2 missing words. And you can read Section 2 of Article 2 in the same way that you read Article 1, Section 8. That's the list of powers given to the president. And so there's really a list, and that list is specified in Section 2. So those are sort of the two big interpretive approaches, and that's how I invite students to think about it myself.
Yeah, I echo the same things. The only thing I would also emphasize, I think the oath is tremendously important in Article 2. It's the only constitutional office explicitly given an oath in a way that Congress and the Supreme Court isn't. So somehow that oath becomes critical to understanding what the presidency is about. But I mean, I think the executive power is vested became important almost immediately in the Pacifica Salvidius debates, which aren't in this packet of reading, but perhaps you're getting to at some point. That is, Hamilton uses that to define an executive power broader than the Constitution specifies. And part of the reason for that breadth is that we can't predict everything the executive will need to be able to do.
Can I ask that's a great point, Ben, and Jeremy, thanks for your opening thoughts on how to frame this question. But Ben, can you say more about why the oath is important? Is it because the powers of the executive are so, I don't want to say broadly defined, but undefined? Executive power is undefined, or was there a concern on the part of the framers with regard to the particular office?
Yeah, I think partially it's because the executive power is so difficult to define, and being difficult to define, it needs a principle of responsibility rather than specification. You can't legally specify everything that the executive will need to do. You can only give the executive power to the president and then direct it somewhere. And I think the oath does that direction: preserve, protect, and defend. Somehow, what the Constitution, what the president will do is preserve, protect, and defend, broadly speaking, whatever that might mean.
Yeah, let me just say something about the difficulty of something like a vesting clause. In the 1776 Constitution that Jefferson proposed for Virginia, there's a phrase something like this: the governor or the administrator shall have all the powers formerly possessed by the king, with the exception of the following powers, and then the king shall neither be a model nor for what the power that the governor's going to have. And so the vesting clause is this tangled attempt to try to use the king as a model of what executive power was, with a list of kingly powers that were explicitly forbidden to the president. By the time Jefferson rewrites another proposed constitution for Virginia, about a decade later, you see a much more nimble vesting clause without all the clutter about the king as a referent point. But it's a nice reminder that this idea of vesting an executive power in some political entity is difficult, because you have to first define what the executive power is. And that raises all sorts of interesting questions.
And I think there's an interesting way in which, in the initial, prior to the Constitution, that initial period, someone asked about the Articles of Confederation, they thought the executive ought to be weak. There was a kind of fear of the king, but by the time of the formation of the Constitution, they'd come around to a position specified pretty clearly by Hamilton in Federalist 70 that they needed a strong executive. In fact, Republican government only survives with a strong executive. That's really a kind of revolution in thinking about the way Republican government works. I think it can't be overstated how important that change is. One of the mistakes I think a lot of students make when they come into studying these things is to say the president must be weak because they didn't like kings. That might have been true in 1776. It wasn't true by 1787. At least for the Federalists, the presidency isn't weak because republics need a strong executive.
Yeah, it seems that the whole period especially during the Revolution, but into the 1780s, quite a few people saw the bad effects of weak executives. Not just, I mean, under the Articles, of course, there was no executive. We know that Congress would create committees, right? Executive committees to try to get things done, and it didn't quite work so well. But even on the state level, in most of the states, the executives were relatively weak, right? I think maybe with the exception of New York, or maybe one or two more, but they went through this period of weak executives on both levels of government. What lessons did they learn from that, and how do you think how was the presidency as envisioned by the framers meant to correct those problems?
So I'm going to chart another sort of axis to answer that, to think about that question as well. And that is, we often invite people to think about the weak versus strong dichotomy on these questions. I think there's another one that's equally important and maybe even more revealing, and that is that, for example, there was an executive. You mentioned it under the articles. There's these committees. What there was not an independent executive. And there were weak executives in the state legislatures, but for the most part, with the exception of Massachusetts and New York, there were not independent executives. And so the early stage constitutions, those from 1776, all had these dependent executives that were creatures of the legislative branch. The later stage constitutions, New York and Massachusetts, had the independent executive, and that movement prefigures what happens in 1787. So you create a president with his or her own independent constituency. And that is, to me, just as radically important as the power, the weak versus strong dichotomy that helps us understand this word executive. So it's not simply that there is this executive, but there's some particular independent entity, and in this case, one person who's going to hold it, and they're going to have their own political constituency.
I think also, I think, yeah, that's a nice point, Jeremy. I also think the principle of unity is critical to a unitary executive, so that executive committees don't work, and that you need one person to execute, partially because one person can execute with energy and vigor in a way committees can't. Anyone who's been on a committee knows there's no energy and vigor in a committee, but also because the principle of responsibility, which I imagine we're going to get to, which is so critical to understanding everything the Federalists are doing, is possible with unity in a way it's impossible with a committee or with a multiple executive. So I think there's this principle of responsibility, unity, and then this odd new principle of the possibility of representative presidency, whatever that might mean.
There's some questions in the chat that I just want to mention real quick. I'm a contrarian on these matters. I don't think Washington matters all that much in terms of the question of designing. I mean, I think it helps that a decent person and an impressive person is going to have the office at first, but I don't think there's this idea we're going to design the office around this guy. That to me would be really short-sighted. I can't imagine that is all that helpful in understanding it. As far as as far as design, not so important in kind of assuring people that it wouldn't be a disaster from the start, probably fairly important.
Yeah, I would say about the Washington, just a couple of things. They did say actually at the convention, we can't design this merely with Washington in mind, because what about whoever comes next? That was sort of explicitly. So while Washington was there, and there was the imagination that the first president would probably be Washington, they were more farsighted than to think we should design this merely around Washington. Instead, this had to be compatible with whoever comes after Washington. That being said, I think it's been rightly said that Washington's popularity and his popularity with the people and his sort of impressiveness, his stature, invested the Constitution with sovereignty I don't think it would have had. In other words, Washington's stature, because Washington's on board, the Constitution looks more appealing to the people than it would have otherwise. Not so much because Washington would be the first president, but because Washington is a kind of popular hero who gives the Constitution sovereignty and authority it wouldn't otherwise have had. And one final thing on Washington, I do think Washington's presidency ends up filling in the details in a way. What we think of as the presidency is defined not all that clearly by the Constitution, defined much more clearly by Washington in his own presidency. And he's very conscious of that, conscious of creating precedents for those who follow him.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, was to maybe reframe the question and say, agree with both of you that the framers did not design the office around Washington, but Washington was conscious that there were some aspects of the office that were not clearly defined by the Constitution, and on certain things he did things that seemed to establish precedent, right? So perhaps, you know, when and when not to use the veto. What's the purpose of the veto power? Of course, that sort of gets worked out in a little bit in the national bank question. Maybe, you know, with regard to foreign policy powers. Are there other things that Washington did in terms of defining the presidency during his own administration that you'd like to maybe bring up to illustrate this point?
I mean, Ben, you both alluded to the most important aspect, and that's foreign policy.
Yeah.
And that's the Neutrality Proclamation, you know, in April of 1793 or June of 1793. And that period of couple weeks there, Americans realize that the president can single-handedly determine the course of American foreign policy. And this decision is really important. And so with control of the presidency comes control of foreign policy. And that may not have been clear to Americans in 1791 or in 1787. And so certainly that decision embedded in the politics of the period, this you know, partisanship for England on the one hand, and this partisanship for France on the other, and for Washington to kind of settle it in terms of policy, not in terms of the politics, was a really important moment. So that's the clearest example.
Yeah, I'd also say, I mean, a couple of things. The titles controversy is an interesting case because the question is, what do you call Washington? And there's an initial attempt by Adams and some of the other Federalists to give him what sounds like kingly names. So to invest him with a kind of royal or kingly authority. That ends up being resisted in favor of something more Republican sounding. And I think that's less Washington than just something that comes during his presidency. It's not entirely clear where he stood on this question, but I do think that that this would be a Republican executive is not yet clear immediately after the founding, and it becomes clear during his presidency. I'd also say, you know, stature or character is important, you know, and one of the things Washington does is establish a kind of presidential character to the office. In fact, so now we call the office either presidential or Washingtonian. A president's being presidential when they're being Washingtonian, and vice versa. I think that can't be underestimated because I do think that's a tremendously important part of what the presidency is.
So you've both brought up the sort of influence of the idea of a king as an executive, and some of the documents that you've recommended, I think, play into that theme, right? I'm thinking especially of the selections from the Federalist and the Cato piece. So would you guys just mind maybe walking us through what are the arguments of the Federalists? First of all, why do we need an independent executive, on Jeremy's point? And what arguments do they make to counter the concerns that we are, in fact, simply establishing a king under a different name, which we know Cato was concerned about as the Anti-Federalist. So can you sort of walk us through the Federalist arguments for this executive and the Anti-Federalist arguments against, please?
Before we do that, maybe Ben can do that. I want to say something a little bit more general about this word executive that we haven't really laid out first. And I think it's helpful in just sort of thinking about it a little bit more. And that is, what Americans might have inherited about this word, in the 1770s and 1780s. And I think there may be a couple ways you can think about this. One is sort of the books path, and the other is the kind of history path. And they're both entangled with each other, obviously. But just from a general, I think, sense of English history, and then also from something like John Locke, you're going to get a couple of things. And number one, most important, is this word executive. So that there's someone whose job it is to carry out the laws. And this has to do with law enforcement. Notice that's totally different than writing the laws. And so the whole premise of an executive power in the Anglo-American tradition, at least post-Locke, is that there's going to be distinction between lawmaking and law enforcing, and that liberty requires the two to be separate. And this was even true of the king. In fact, the king would issue proclamations, but under proclamations, like executive orders, that would be the same notion, is that a proclamation is the announcement of the execution of a law, not the announcement of a creation of a new law. That the proclamation does not make new law. A proclamation is simply an enforcement of a prior existing law. So Parliament, or the Congress, the legislative power, is lawmaking. The other bit has something to do with some control of foreign policy, or what Locke called the federative power. And that's a little bit more complicated, because it seems that Parliament has some participation, excuse me, in foreign policy matters and in war making, and that obviously, it makes it a little bit more complicated. Finally, on the question of unity, what is interesting about this is the movement in English politics, which preceded the American movement, which happens very quickly. Is there was at first a consensus that there needed to be some small council advising the king, a privy council, that would serve as a kind of linkage to the legislative power. But the smallness is what gave you the unity. It's what gave you the secrecy decision dispatch that Hamilton talks about in Fed 70. And so for about 150 to 200 years, all those things were associated with plurality, but a very small plurality. In fact, Washington uses this language throughout the Revolutionary War to refer to a plural body of officers that he had around him. At some point, the word becomes more closely, these characters become more closely associated with monarchy, in the way that the English are fighting over various powers throughout the 18th century between the crown and the monarchy. And so when Hamilton reaches for this language in Federalist 70, he's employing language that would be well known to Americans as having undergone this transition from being sort of fairly conventional defenses of a plural privy council to something that turns into an executive held by one person. So that's sort of one thing I would say, but the most important thing would be thinking more about what the consensus about an executive would be among most Anglo-Americans in the period. I think is pretty helpful.
Yeah, I'd also say, in terms of this question between execution and legislation, the passage at the start of Federalist 72 strikes me as tremendously important and too often forgotten. That is this, the administration of government in its largest sense, and then there's about 4 or 5 sentences that follow, all of which point to the real action of government will be in administration, will be in carrying out the law and figuring out how to carry out the law. And then, even as Publius says here, the preparatory plans of finance, the application and disbursement of the public monies in conformity to the general appropriations of the legislature, the arrangements. So there's all these executive details that for which the executive will be primarily responsible. I think it's important to emphasize this because, in thinking about it, with the executive we have now and the legislature we have now, it said, well, the executive does too much. That might or might not be the case, but it's definitely not the case that the Publius or the founders were expecting the executive not to do very much. At least as Hamilton lays it out here, politics is going mostly going to be mostly the politics of administration, and that the politics of administration will be taken care of mostly by the presidency.
Another on your question about the Anti-Federalist, it's always struck me, and it struck me again when I was selecting documents for this, is the Anti-Federalists don't have all that much to say about the presidency. Their concern is mostly for the what they see as the unlimited nature of congressional power, especially the power to lay direct taxes. And so people like Brutus and Federal Farmer are focusing most of their firepower there. The presidency, they don't really think about all that much, and so it's kind of a stretch to find anti-federalists. And so this Cato essay is one of the very few. And notice what he zeroes in on, that the president would be able to have a kind of informal power that would eventually add up to something more than his formal powers. It abetted by a kind of corrupting patronage system, which would create a core of executive officers who would be loyal to the president.
Do you think that's because they didn't fully understand what this was, this notion of a Republican executive? I mean, because it sometimes seems you're right. I've been struck by that, because Hamilton writes in these papers as though there's this vigorous attack on the presidency, and it's hard to find. It's hard to find that in the anti-feds as much as you'd expect, given the way Hamilton's writing in the Fed 70 to 72. But do they just not understand it? Because I asked that partially because I think Madison ends up not fully understanding it. You know, in Helvidius, it strikes me that he's seen something new about the presidency, this new kind of Republican presidency, that he didn't necessarily see even at the founding, even a couple of years earlier. I don't know. I asked that more as what you think, Jeremy.
My sense, again, is the Neutrality Proclamation surprised everyone, that there would be these European wars between superpowers that would be determined. Our participation in European wars would be determined by a single dude, rather than us just being left alone over here. For some reason, I think that more or less escaped them. And then as far as the rest of it, I mean, think about it. I mean, presidents don't do that much in the 18th and 19th centuries. They issue vetoes. They, fire and hire, a fleet of, customs collectors and postmaster generals. But they're not actually doing that much until they become kind of signifiers for control of Congress and which party gets to run things. So the Whigs win, the Whigs are in control. The Democrats win, the Democrats are in control. And then there's a bunch of jobs that change hand. And then maybe every once in a while they have to, issue the Nullification Proclamation or go whack the KKK or something like that. But, they're not doing that much.
But that's why so much hangs on. I mean, the other reading that there was the Clay response to Jackson. I think so much hangs on the Clay rejecting this power of removal, because it does unite so much into the executive administration. And especially now that Jackson will not only be the head of this administration, but will also be invested with popular authority. So you have a pretty big presidency that the Whigs are worried about. One sign, though, of no one yet understanding what this was is Clay's attempt to call Jackson a Tory. Which strikes me as, it's an odd locution, right, for such a popular presidency. But yeah, wouldn't you say that the president could become the center of this new government is partially what hangs on the Whig rejection of removal power?
Yeah, the Whigs have a really sort of wild notion of what the presidency is going to be. One term, no removal power, no veto really for policy reasons, and they just kind of invent this view of what the constitutional presidency requires. And by the way, what it adds up to is a kind of legislative supremacy, especially, and there are versions of it. That's when you drill down, there's a version that comes out of the Senate, and there's a version that comes out of the House that are a bit different. So bicameralism affects the way their arguments work. But just another point of your question, back to your Fed 72 and Hamilton's emphasis on administration. Notice what the punchline there is, and that is that it's about the term limit. And the argument is we shouldn't have a term limit because presidents are going to want to remove executive officers. And these executive officers are the ones who are actually going to do administration. So the case for an infinite number of terms is really a case for letting there be these heads of departments who are actually doing the administration and who need to be left alone by these silly presidents who come around every 4 years and want to fire them. That's how I read Fed 72.
Well, that's part of the case, right? That's part of the case. I don't think that's the only case. That's part of the case. I mean, part of the case is, you go back though, the other part of the case is the principle of responsibility, that the only way you can hold the principle of responsibility is that presidents can be reelected.
Yeah, I don't actually believe Hamilton believes that, but anyway, I think this, but in fact, I think 72, reveals a sense in which Hamilton wants administration to be completely irresponsible. That stability is the preferred norm with respect to administration, not responsibility. So in fact, there are kind of two executives at war with each other. One, the president, who has to deal with these silly elections, and then there's the real people who are actually running the show, which I think is motivating Clay's argument as well. And a couple decades later.
So you brought up Clay and you brought up the removal power. Can we talk about what are the arguments that Clay and Madison make with regard to the removal power, and in what ways are those arguments similar and different, and what are they in particular responding to when they're making these arguments?
Well, real quick on Madison. So that letter that Madison writes to Pendleton is really wonderful because it condenses in like 2 paragraphs what were days and days and days of debates. And Madison brings the debate over whether the Constitution gives the president the power to fire the Secretary of State, or whether or not the Congress gives Congress that power to delegate that power to the president or somebody else to fire the Secretary of State. And there are 4 interpretive positions. Barely Madison's position, the president has his power under the Constitution, wins. Madison makes 2 arguments there. One, it's good for responsibility or accountability, what we've been talking about. And secondly, Madison makes the difference in the vesting clause argument. And so it's Madison, not Hamilton, who first points. So I think Madison's the first person in the world to point to the difference in the vesting clauses in order to argue for an enhanced presidential authority. And he does that in 1789 before there are political parties. That's an important thing about that debate. It happens more or less at the same time as the Bill of Rights, June of 1789. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, also at stake in Madison's argument is, so there's the principle of responsibility, there's the vesting, and then there's the principle of independence argument, that the executive can't be independent if he can't control his subordinate the officers below him. So the Madisonian argument is, the need for executive independence on this question, which then also follows from the need for executive responsibility. You can't be held responsible if you're not independent in your exercise of power.
Yeah, right, exactly. So in independence of the executive requires dependence by the other executive officials.
Yeah.
And so he says there's a chain of dependence connecting the electorate, he says the people, but let's say the electorate to the president and the president to the administration. And so that chain has to have some sort of importance if there's actually going to be responsibility in the system overall. So yeah, Ben's absolutely right.
And then, I think so Jeremy, you would say that part Clay's rejection of the removal power is partially the attempt to create an executive independent of the popular executive in a way.
That's one possibility. The other possibility is that it's more innocent, and it could be closer to the Roger Sherman position that emerges in 1789. And that position is something like this: look, Congress creates the office, so Congress needs to figure out what the rules are for firing the officer, and so there needs to be a kind of flexibility that adapts to the situation at hand, because not all problems are the same. Not all administrative problems are the same, so therefore Congress should be able to do this. What that is, in another form, you could say, is legislative supremacy, but I think that undercuts the kind of sensible, logic to the position. And this is something Oliver Wendell Holmes will later say in the Myers case. That is, look, Congress can destroy the State Department tomorrow. Certainly, he doesn't say in the context of the State Department. Congress can destroy the office tomorrow. Therefore, Congress can figure out the rules for firing the officer today.
This is really interesting. There's so many good things going on here, and I'm just trying to frame in my mind a clearer understanding. Something that you brought up earlier, the idea of a Republican presidency or a Republican executive. We brought this up earlier in the context of how it was different from the executive in a king. And Jeremy, I think you said that, or was it Ben? I can't remember which. I apologize. Said that Madison came to realize, or seemed to come to realize, that there was much more to this idea of a Republican executive than he had anticipated. So I'm trying to get a grip on what that means, or what you meant by that. Is it that whereas Madison favored an independent executive for the sake of responsibility, Hamilton's understanding was independence is important not for responsibility, but simply to unfetter, or to give unfettered sort of energy or power to administrators to just get things done. Is that one of the things that Madison comes to see in the Republican presidency that he doesn't like? Or am I way off base here?
Well, I'm trying to figure out the last part of your question. That is Hamilton. What Hamilton? Because I think I disagree with Jeremy regarding the relationship between executive, the independence and power of the executive for Hamilton, and the principle of responsibility for Hamilton. It seems that I do think part of the analysis of the president's power and of his independence follows from, or is connected fundamentally to, the fact that he can be held responsible. So without responsibility, there's not the argument for power. Without the argument for power, tripping myself up. So, that's what the last part of your question. But the first part was whether Madison had come to see the Republican executive as more dangerous. I don't know. I think he came to see that it was more powerful. Whether he came to see that it was more powerful because rooted in the people, in the way the Whigs came to see, I'm not sure about that, honestly.
My view is that Madison came to pretty much hold the Jeffersonian position on the potential that the president would have as a kind of avatar for public opinion, and that's very different than Hamilton's notion. For sure. At best, Hamilton believed that election day was the day the president's responsible, and not any other day, that the other 1,000 days of the cycle. But I don't even believe that Hamilton believed that. I believed he thought it was a necessity and he had to defend it. He would have preferred a much different system. So I want to step back again for a second and just these issues that we're talking about again with the executive power. So first of all, on the constitutional side, I would say there's a parallel puzzle in Article 2. The Constitution is very clear on how you get a treaty. The Constitution is very clear on how you get an executive officer. The Constitution is silent on how you end a treaty, and it's silent on how you get rid of an officer. And both of those puzzles have been attempted to be solved with reference to the vesting clause and the difference between the vesting clauses. So Hamilton in the case of the treaty power, Madison in the case of the removal power. And so notice that we can already see in trying to define the executive that there's a difference when we're talking about foreign policy questions and domestic policy questions. And that's even the case today among modern so-called Unitarian scholars, is that the foreign policy Unitarians aren't necessarily on the same page with the domestic policy Unitarians. And that's an interesting, I think, part of this in negotiating what this word means and its application. And it's a reminder that we have to have some clarity about this word executive and some sort of way of answering that. And what I argue, or what I suggest people to consider, is that in answering that puzzle, what this word executive means, that for the Americans, that word changed once it became an independent executive with its own constituency. That the political power of the president through its electoral base added to or transformed the inherited notion of executive that they had. And that difference between the Jacksonian, that comes to a head between the Jacksonians and the Whigs. That's where it becomes most stark. It's latent between the Jeffersonians and the Federalists. Between the Jacksonians and the Whigs, it comes to a head.
Yeah, sort of on this point, I think it's worth clarifying the question of the source of the president's authority, because this is also what's at stake in Clay's rejection of Jackson. And I think in a certain way, Hamilton's rejection of Jefferson. That is that the source of the authority of the president is fundamentally for Hamilton, and I think for Clay, the Constitution. The Constitution is what gives president's authority. Popular election doesn't on its own give authority. What popular election does, at least for Clay, and I think also for perhaps for Hamilton, is judge how a president's been doing. So the principle of responsibility is the principle of judgment. So presidents don't get authority from the popular election. They're just judged for how they've been doing as a constitutional officer. So the people do have an entrance into the constitutional process or the political process, but it's only as a matter of judgment, of responsibility, not a matter of giving the president authority to go forward. It's not a forwards-looking authority; it's a backward-looking authority. That's where the people can judge. They can't. I think the Federalist argument would just be that the people don't judge well what should be done, and so it doesn't make sense for them to choose the president who should do X, X, and X. They should just be judging how presidents under the politics of administration have done things in their past term. And that's why I think it's important that presidents not only be re-eligible for one term, but I think the argument Hamilton makes in these papers you read for today is infinitely re-eligible. I think there's a good argument that Hamilton wouldn't want a two-term presidency either, because a two-term presidency brings up questions. There's the passage about, then the question is, what will we do next, not what has been done. And Hamilton thinks the people judge well only what has been done, not what should be done.
To crystallize something just very quickly for the audience, Jackson believed the election of 1832 settled the question of the bank in his favor. The Whigs said, just like modern social scientists today say, that no, you can't settle an election, or an election can't settle a simple policy issue. There's all sorts of stuff going on. Maybe they voted because Jackson's opponent was for it before he's against it. Maybe there's all sorts of complications in settling what an election means. And Lincoln makes this very argument in the context of the Mexican War as a young Whig.
Yeah, Lincoln also makes this argument in the context of Jackson, a speech against this principle of election settling things, that Congress settles things.
Yeah.
Congress can judge well what needs to be done, not one president. There's all kinds of reasons people might have voted for a president, none of which might have settled this important political question.
Well, you guys you've outrun me again. And I apologize. I'm trying to keep up here. I'm still back on Hamilton and Madison, so forgive me if this is getting circular in a way. I'm trying to clarify my question from earlier. I think you've helped me clarify it a little bit. But you brought up, Jeremy, you mentioned the treaty making power and the appointment of officers power. It's clear that those are presidential powers, but when it comes to removal, it's not so clear. So correct me where I'm wrong on this, please, just so I understand it. Hamilton believed that that the what do you call it, abrogation or nullification of a treaty was an executive power or presidential power, and removal of officers was a presidential power. Madison disagreed on both of those points. Those were legislative powers.
No.
Okay.
No. So Madison's pro removal. Yeah, Madison's pro removal.
Okay.
He does not believe the treaty power is naturally executive. So therefore the exception to the rule doesn't go the way that Hamilton sees it. So the rule is they're both shared with the Senate. A treaty shared the Senate. The appointments shared with the Senate. Those are the exceptions to the rule. The rule being the natural home of appointment is the executive. The natural home of the treaty power is the executive. Madison disputes that with respect to the treaty power. He says a treaty is more like a piece of legislation than it is like an act of execution. So therefore, the logic doesn't apply here.
I see.
So now Hamilton and I'm an outlier on this. What Hamilton's view is on the removal power, but in Federalist 77, Hamilton says, as clear as a bell, the consent of the Senate be required to displace as well as to appoint. And the position that people have taken is either that was a mistake, a sloppy error, or that he later changed his mind. I'm on record as saying that you can't demonstrate either, and that in fact, it seems to me that if you read 77 as it's actually written, it actually comports rather well with his first two paragraphs of Fed 72. So anyway, I would classify, in the spirit of being moderate, I would classify Hamilton as kind of mysterious on the location of the removal power, which is ironic.
It's just to be, Madison is very clear that the removal power does belong to the president. I think so. Again, this is this odd way in which Madison is more pro-legislature on treaty power, but more pro-executive on removal power. And if Jeremy's right, and I'm getting closer to thinking he's right on the Hamilton is more pro-leg. There's one person who makes this argument regarding Hamilton, and it's Dr. Bailey here. So I'm sort of getting close to being convinced, but nonetheless.
So you use this term that there are sort of natural homes for these powers, and so this is really helping me, I think, be clearer about this. So like a treaty is much more like an act of legislation or a piece of legislation, and so it's a
that's
natural
Madison's
home.
Helvidius. Yes.
Madison's Helvidius argument. Yeah. But Hamilton made the argument that the natural home for the powers with regard to treaties or nullifying treaties was an executive function. Where was Hamilton coming from on this? Is this because this was a traditional power of executive power of the British king, or is this because the president is what does he call him, the organ of intercourse with foreign powers? Where does Hamilton fall on the treaty power?
He was blinded by the writers who were blinded by the splendor of the British monarchy.
Okay. Was that a Madison quote?
Yes.
That's Helvidius.
Yeah.
That's Helvidius.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
No, I think, that for Hamilton,
Montesquieu and Locke he was referring to, right?
For Hamilton, if you have the federative power, that is the power to conduct foreign relations, you have to be able to do all of it. So you have to do those things in general necessary to conduct foreign relations, and that's much better done by one person in charge of an administration than it is done by a Congress that's kind of all over the place. Legislatures aren't good at foreign policy. And so this is naturally an executive power. And so Hamilton's argument as pacificist is that the war-making power, it does belong to the legislature, but we should construe that exception strictly. It's a strict exception. It shouldn't bleed into other things that the executive ought to possess. So Hamilton wouldn't go so far as like John Yoo does now and say that the president can on his own make war. But Hamilton does say the president can set the conditions under which the legislature will declare war. So they create what Hamilton calls an antecedent state of affairs, within which the legislature might declare war after the president has submitted it to them for declaration. But it's not but that declaration should be construed strictly as an exception to the executive power, rather that the power to go to war is naturally an executive power. The Constitution accepts it out. And again, Madison reads that differently. Madison would say, something like the treaty making power is naturally a legislative power. So too the declaration of war, those are naturally legislative powers.
Yeah, that seems to be the part of Hamilton's argument that Madison really takes exception to, doesn't it? I mean, the idea that the war power is, or the power of making war, if you want to put it that way, is a presidential power. Declaring war is an exception to that grant, and Madison really goes after, or
that's what he
really goes after.
That's what he objects to most. I mean, it's odd, when you think about it, because it's so different. Madison's principal objection is to a principle that's not even at stake in this debate. So the debate has to do with one set of things. Hamilton, in making the argument for the treaty for the Washington's action, mentioned this exception, and that's what Madison sort of focuses on the most, partially on a kind of principle of constitutional interpretation, that as soon as you start reading the Constitution in terms of implications and exceptions that aren't there, you lose sight of what the Constitution means entirely.
You're muted, Chris.
You're muted.
Sorry, what's immediately at stake is the effect that Washington's proclamation would have on the state of relations between the United States and Great Britain and France, right, or Europe. And yeah, so that's interesting.
Let me add just one important sort of historical marker, and that is that the proclamation itself was roughly it was part of a relationship with Congress, in which Congress passed a law requiring the president to announce by proclamation that the president would use the armed forces essentially to keep Americans from messing with English and French ships. And this is basically a framework that presidents rely on. And so he does it again with the Whiskey Rebellion proclamations. And so these proclamations are an announcement or a warning to Americans to abide by the law before something else happens. And so there's a big foreign policy angle here, but also just in terms of thinking about legislative executive relations, notice that there's a framework in which the president's complying with a procedure by set by Congress, asking the president to abide by certain conditions before the president does something.
Yeah, I was gonna ask this. Even the power of issuing proclamations. So, Jeremy, if I'm understanding this correctly, are you saying that when Washington at least issues these proclamations, he's doing so, he's authorized to do so by some piece of legislation passed by Congress? Where does the power of issuing proclamations come from? Is that just assumed that's?
So it's from British practice, and again under the so-called proclamation case, which the jurist Cook talks about. The settled understanding is a proclamation is to announce the enforcement of a law, not to announce a new law, or to create a new law rather. and this is how it's understood. And they were especially useful in Anglo-American practice for the king telling people to, stop harassing the Indians, stop harassing the French, stop harassing each other. And then they turn into, hey, stop, rebelling against us. So there's all sorts of proclamations that look an awful lot like Lincoln or Johnson's proclamations about urging Americans to abide by the law. And so there's a line connecting George III's proclamation against rebellious Americans to Washington's Neutrality Proclamation, to his Whiskey Rebellion Proclamation, to the Nullification Proclamation, all the way up to Lincoln and Johnson's proclamations. And then as recently as 1991, actually more recent than that, but George Bush issued a proclamation like that in the context of the LA riots. And it's seen as a protection for American liberty in the sense that it used to require, and those who know your Lincoln, this will resonate, it used to require, at least in the 1790s, a certification that the courts of justice could not do their job. And so that's why Washington brings that up in the proclamation, the Whiskey Proclamation. By the time of 1807, that certification requirement drops away.
But Pacificus justifies the Neutrality Proclamation entirely on executive power. It doesn't make reference, if I remember correctly, to a legislative authority. It's instead within the realm of executive, what the executive can and can't do.
Yeah, that's fine. But notice what it does. It's an announcement to Americans we're at peace, so cut it out.
Yeah.
So stop messing with their ships.
So there's that court case, right? The court case where they the jury finds for the those who have been prosecuted under the Neutrality Proclamation on the grounds that there's no law. It's just a proclamation. It's an executive act, not a law, and so the jury can't be found. Those being tried can't be found guilty. It's a kind of interesting case because it's a jury acting constitutionally in this interesting way at this point. Constitutionally in the sense that they're making reference to whether this is actually a law rather than merely an executive proclamation.
My point is a simpler one, and that is that there's an invitation to a puzzle here, and the puzzle is when a president issues a proclamation saying I've decided something, and then does so in a way that abides by a kind of congressional framework. Is that completely unilateral action? Is that a president acting on his own, or is there some sort of cooperation here? And now in some cases the president can choose not to act, and so obviously a decision to issue the proclamation matters, and that's where all the importance is, certainly for foreign policy reasons. But it is important to just recognize that Washington is not simply on his own saying, hey, you whiskey rebels, if you don't cut it out, I'm going to do X. He's actually operating under a statutory framework for doing X.
Yeah, at times, although I'd say, probably the most famous proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln understood as a proclamation independent of.
Sure, that's right. Yeah, not all of these do that, right? Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I was hoping we'd move in that direction, and we've got a recommendation to read Lincoln's letter to Hodges, where he explains or tries to justify his Emancipation Proclamation in light of other acts of emancipation by his generals, right? But before we do that, I hesitate to do this, but there is a question that's been up there for a while. Adam asked about the impeachment of Johnson with regard to the firing. Before we move off the removal power entirely, I thought maybe we should address this question. So
really quickly, my understanding is the Tenure of Office Act is more or less a recycled version of Clay's proposal. And
I also
the Whigs have been trying to do this for years, and this was their moment, and it was a trap, obviously. But the important point is that it's not a trap that comes out of the blue. Rather, it has a long history inside Whig politics, and you can see it in the Clay speech.
Yeah, although I think that's right. It's not a trap that comes out. This trap was available, but it's still a trap. It was passed in order for Johnson to do something for which he could be impeached, because they're not.
But we could imagine a similar law. We could imagine a Congress would make a similar law with respect to the administrator of Afghanistan or Iraq.
Yeah, yeah,
So it's not completely out of the blue.
yeah.
You can imagine how Congress could think this. Oh, this is a good idea. We disagree with the reconstruction policy in Iraq. We're going to pass a law saying the president can't fire this person until we approve of their replacement.
I mean, Congress did pass a law on Afghanistan saying that if the troops, I can't remember, if the troops reduced below a certain level, the president had to present it and get approval by Congress, and the president, Trump and then Biden, just ignored that law.
Very interesting. So I'm backtracking then a little bit here, and I'm glad we're sort of, we talked about this line of development with regard to the purpose of proclamations, and then we get to the Emancipation Proclamation. So does Lincoln? Does Lincoln transform the purpose of presidential proclamations? Is what he does new with the Emancipation Proclamation? How does that affect later proclamations? And then I'm going to throw out the big question that a lot of people really like to argue about, and that is, how does Lincoln transform executive power? I mean, that's a big, wide open question. So I'm just gonna let you guys do what you can with it in the next, whatever time we have left.
Ben has more to say on this than I do. So let me make two quick points. One is that I don't think thinking about the Emancipation Proclamation in the context of proclamations is all that helpful. I think there are bigger issues here. So I've just made the case for thinking about proclamations as a kind of thing. I'm going to now take back everything I said in the context of Lincoln and talk about it a different way. Second point is,
You can do that. Yeah, I'm sorry, you can't. Go ahead.
I think the emphasis on the oath of office that Ben's going to talk about is really important. And I'll just point out that Jefferson does not do that. And you don't see the oath of office mentioned, for example, in the letter to John Colvin. And I think Lincoln is terribly wrong. Go ahead.
It somehow seems unfair that Jeremy has disagreed with me before I started speaking. First I'd say I agree, but that thinking about the Emancipation Proclamation in terms of other proclamations, I think is probably misleading and not all that helpful. And what's important about it is instead this question of military necessity. I mean, the kind of fascinating thing about the letter to Hodges is it's a lesson in what is and is not military necessity. You can't claim it on mere pretense. So that's why the earlier attempts at emancipation aren't justified, because they're not yet military necessity. I mean, isn't that an amazing thing to do? In other words, you can't just say military necessity, now emancipate. It actually has to be military necessity in order to justify emancipation. And why does it have to be a military necessity? Because Lincoln doesn't have the legislative power. Lincoln can't legislate the emancipation of the slaves. And what's interesting is Congress at the time was talking about doing precisely that. So you go back to the congressional debates of this time period, and Congress is talking about by legislation emancipating the slaves, not the 14th Amendment, not anything like that, but merely passing a piece of legislation that would emancipate the slaves. And in a way, it's not surprising, because there's lots of Whigs who had been asserting the power of Congress for a long time. And so under that assertion, they say they can do it, Lincoln can't. So the emancipation, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. So just so I'm clear, so when Congress is considering this legislation, they were going to justify emancipation on necessity as well?
On necessity, right.
Okay, good. Sorry,
right.
Good. Keep going.
They claimed they could judge military necessity as well, if not better than the president. So they were making claims about legislative supremacy in that context. But Lincoln, so there's a kind of, the nature of executive power is such that you have to do this. And then Lincoln locates a lot of authority in, as Jeremy already said, the oath. That is, the power to preserve, protect, and defend has to include the power to preserve, protect, and defend. That is, to do those things necessary in order to preserve the Constitution. So if you have to suspend the writ of habeas corpus or justify the Emancipation Proclamation, you do it in terms of constitutional authority. And for Lincoln, that constitutional authority is the only source of his authority. It can't be popular authority because he's not a representative. He's a representative of the people as a constitutional people. He's not a representative of the people directly. And so the source of his authority can't be merely that the people want it. In fact, I think Lincoln would think there's something a little dangerous about the notion that his authority lies merely in what the people want. His authority lies in what the Constitution has the powers the Constitution has given to him. And the oath is that power.
So is Lincoln's argument then that in order to defend the Constitution, or at least the bulk of it, the president has to, in some cases, or may have to act in some cases, extra constitutionally, unconstitutionally?
Yeah.
So, letter of the Constitution?
What Lincoln, whether it's unconstitutional or extra constitutional, it's a long story, and perhaps it gets deep. But I think the Lincoln argument at its simplest is, there's the life limb metaphor he uses in the letter to Hodges. That is, if he doesn't suspend the writ of habeas corpus or issue the Emancipation Proclamation, and they lose the Constitution, then he sacrificed the life for the sake of the limb. You have to cut off the limb in order to save the life. And so what Lincoln does as a matter of presidential authority is save the life and sacrifice the limb. Whether that's, I don't think it's unconstitutional. I think in the end, that the passage from the letter to Hodges, I took measures otherwise. Let me pull it up just so. Yeah, so he says, by general law, life and limb must be protected, yet often a limb must be amputated to save a life, but a life is never wisely given to save a limb. And I think I felt that measures otherwise unconstitutional might become lawful by becoming indispensable to the preservation of the Constitution through the preservation of the nation. So they're unconstitutional, but become constitutional because they're necessary.
Yeah. So stepping away from the substance of the decision itself into the justification of the decision, it seems to me the reliance on the oath here is simply a fig leaf for, this is an opportunity to resolve all those puzzles that we've pointed out before by saying, oh, look, the oath becomes like magic. And these questions disappear. Now, the interesting question is why make the argument this way? And that's because Lincoln, I think, thinks it's safer that Jackson or somebody like that in his place wouldn't make the argument this way. And so all of the careful provisions that you see laid out that Ben talks about in the letter to Hodges as actually constraints on the use of this power, that make this power as narrow as possible, are all, I think, his attempts to rein it in. But I just think as a historical matter, it seems preposterous to me that the designers of the Constitution believe the oath was meant any more than a formal moment to mark the transfer of power, and to read into it, as Lincoln does, a grant of additional power seems to me just kind of interpretively messy. But
so I guess I would resist on the question of what it's additional authority that is activated by the situations that require them. It's not, so a president can't do anything as a matter of oath. And that's why so important in this letter are all the qualifications Lincoln introduces on his exercise of it. That is, it has to actually be for the preservation of the Constitution. But I guess why put it in there if they don't mean it? I mean, it's a principle of responsibility and authority that something like Washington's Whiskey Rebellion, response to the Whiskey Rebellion, is also in a way a fulfillment of the oath. I'm not sure my read on it was that no one would have said this is what they were doing because the assumption is this is what they were doing. That executives, as executives, have a responsibility to stability, and that the oath signifies that.
I mean, what this argument basically is the oath of office is essentially an emergency clause, and we have an emergency clause, and it's called the habeas corpus clause. And so it would seem to me that if you read the oath as an emergency clause, then you have to start to think about its relationship to others and why it wasn't talked about in those. I mean, I think it's much more sensible to see it A as a marker of the transfer authority, and B as some kind of binding thing on the president by which the president can be judged for impeachment purposes, maybe, but not as an enhancement of authority. I think to me that's the difficulty I have. And just finally, I mean, as I watch military incompetence, 1,000-fold of the last week, do I really trust these people to tell me what military necessity is? Good God.
It's a good question.
We can't always choose. We seem to be. That's a nice point. I mean, I guess that we've been having this conversation for 10 years.
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
Well, on that note, we have about 3 minutes left. So I think we've raised a lot of great questions, and we're probably leaving with more questions than we began with, which I think is good because we're going to have 4 more webinars to try to understand the executive power more fully. And Jeremy, I know you're going to be back, right? I think for one more.
Yeah, at the end. Yeah.
At the end. That's great. Yeah. Last thoughts, other things that you want to throw out there, Jeremy and Ben, that will maybe frame some of our future discussions or questions that we ought to be considering as we move forward discussing the executive?
I don't have anything. Thank you. This was great.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, one for teachers, I would think one exercise would be is for students, how would the Constitution be different if if Article 2 said all executive powers herein granted shall be vested in the President of the United States, and would that the list that follows in Section 2 be sufficient?
I'd also say this is something when I talk to teachers, I'll often emphasize the differing notion of popular responsibility you see in these papers by comparison to the way we think about it now.
Yeah.
That is that elections are judgments about how an elected officer has exercised their responsibility is the principle you see through the Federalist Papers and through something like Madison's letter to Pendleton. And that notion isn't something we really have anymore. That because it really comes down to this question. I often say, are we better off than we were 4 years ago? Is the Publius's question. I mean, that is in a way the question that the Federalists are wanting us to ask.
You mean as opposed to like a programmatic endorsement for future goodies?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I know that your read on Jefferson is the latter, but I think it's useful to have this, on our plate, the notion that we could be judging what's been done.
I like that formulation. I'm going to steal it and use it in class.
Well, thank you both very much for your time this morning and thoughts. Learned a great deal from this. It's very interesting and lively conversation. So again, thank you both very much. Thanks to everybody who joined us today. Thanks for those who submitted questions. I just want to remind everybody about the email you'll receive with that link for a certificate of participation. Also, if you've enjoyed our conversation today, please look into the other resources that TAH provides, tah.org through Ashbrook. For example, we have another webinar series called Documents in Detail. I think these are Wednesday evenings, and each month they look at a single document. Also, our Rediscovering America in-person seminars are back, so keep an eye on the tah.org website for dates and topics. You can help us spread the word about these webinars and our other programs by sharing the archive link that you'll receive in your email next week. Please share this with your colleagues on social media and any other way possible. We'd appreciate it. Our next webinar will be Saturday, September 11th, and we'll be discussing powers in conflict and concert, the executive and Congress. So hope you can make it then. Until then, take care, and hopefully see you in another month.
Thanks again for listening. Our next Saturday webinar for the 21-22 school year will take place on Saturday, September 11th at 11 a.m. Eastern. You can find out more information about our webinars and register for these free programs at tah.org/programs/webinars.